There is a pattern, a mathematical sequence that repeats throughout history whenever a government needs to bury a mistake that is too dangerous to reveal. It is not random. It is not accidental. It is a specific, calculated protocol that has been executed by the United States government over and over again. I call it the Expendable Protocol. Most people view the history of World War II as a binary struggle, good versus evil, light versus darkness. We are taught that the United States was the guardian of morality, fighting against a regime that treated human beings as raw material. But if you look at the declassified files, the documents that were stamped top secret and buried in the archives for 80 years, you see a different story. You see a system that didn't just fight the enemy, it adopted the enemy's methods. You see a system where the preservation of a secret was mathematically weighed against the lives of American soldiers, and the soldiers lost every single time. This protocol follows 3 distinct stages. Stage 1 is suppression. This is the initial reaction to a massive failure of command. When incompetence leads to slaughter, the government erases the timeline to protect the reputation of the leadership. They don't fix the problem. They delete the victims. Stage 2 is deception. This happens when the threat comes from inside. When our own stockpiles or strategies backfire, the system lies to its own medical personnel. They sacrifice the injured to protect the asset. And then there is Stage 3. Stage 3 is the one that should terrify you. Stage 3 is experimentation. This is the final phase of the protocol, where the pretense of defense is dropped entirely. In Stage 3, the military stops viewing its citizens as people to be protected and starts viewing them as biological inventory to be used. Okay? I'm going to open 3 specific files that prove this pattern is not a theory. It is a historical fact. These are not conspiracy theories. These are documented events involving the death of hundreds of men in a botched rehearsal in England, the chemical poisoning of an entire harbor in Italy, and the systematic torture of American troops in research labs on U.S. soil. By the end of this, you will understand exactly how the protocol works. You will see why these files were hidden for decades. And you will realize that for the macro system, the individual soldier is nothing more than a variable in a cold equation. Let's begin with Stage 1, suppression. To understand Stage 1, we have to look at one of the darkest secrets of the European theater. We are going to April 1944. The location is Slapton Sands, on the coast of Devon, England. The world is holding its breath. The invasion of Normandy, D-Day, is only weeks away. The Allied command knows that this is the turning point. Failure is not an option. To ensure success, the U.S. Army organizes a massive live-fire rehearsal. They codename it Exercise Tiger. This was not a small drill. This was a full-scale simulation involving 30,000 troops and 300 ships. The goal was to make it as real as possible. They used live ammunition. They created a replica of Utah Beach. They wanted the men to feel the chaos of war before they hit the French coast. But the chaos they got was not part of the plan. On the night of April 27th, a convoy of 8 American LSTs, landing ship tanks, was moving through Lime Bay. These were slow, heavy vessels packed with soldiers, trucks, and engineering equipment. Due to a catastrophic breakdown in communication, the British destroyer that was supposed to protect them never showed up. The American convoy was effectively naked in the English Channel. In the darkness, a patrol of 9 German E-boats, fast attack torpedo boats, slipped through the Allied defense screen. They picked up the radio traffic. They saw the silhouettes of the slow-moving American ships. It was a wolf pack finding a flock of sheep. The Germans opened fire. The water turned into an inferno. Torpedoes slammed into the sides of the American ships. LST 507 and LST 531 were hit immediately. The explosions ignited the fuel and ammunition on board. Men were trapped below decks in burning steel coffins. The heat was so intense it melted the metal. Those who managed to jump into the water faced a different kind of death. The water was freezing. Many of the soldiers had not been properly trained on how to use their life belts. They put them around their waists instead of under their arms. When they hit the water, the weight of their heavy packs flipped them upside down. Their legs floated, but their heads were forced underwater. Hundreds of men drowned simply because of bad training. By the time the sun came up, the water was filled with bodies. The official casualty count was staggering. 749 American soldiers died that night. To put that number in perspective, The actual invasion of Utah Beach, the real D-Day landing that these men were practicing for, cost fewer lives than the rehearsal. More men died in the practice run than in the main event. This was a disaster of epic proportions. It was a failure of protection, a failure of communication, and a failure of command. In a transparent system, this would have led to inquiries, resignations, and a public mourning for the dead. But this was war, and the protocol was in effect. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower looked at the report and saw a strategic nightmare. If the news got out that the Germans had successfully penetrated the Allied defenses and slaughtered a convoy, it would reveal the location of the invasion practice. It might tip off the Nazis that Normandy was the target. It would destroy troop morale right before the most important battle of the century. So Eisenhower made a decision. He triggered Stage 1, suppression. He ordered a total blackout on the incident. It was erased from the record. The survivors, the men who had just spent hours pulling their dead friends out of the freezing oil-slicked water, were gathered together. They were not given counseling. They were given a threat. They were sworn to absolute secrecy. They were told that if they spoke a word of what happened at Slapton Sands, they would face immediate court-martial. The suppression went even deeper. What do you do with 700 bodies when you can't admit they died? You bury them in secret. The dead were placed in mass graves in England, temporarily unidentified. The government effectively hid the bodies to hide the mistake. But the cruelest part of Stage 1 was reserved for the families back home in Iowa, in Ohio, in New York. When the telegrams finally went out, they were lies. The families were not told that their sons died in a training accident in April. They were told that their sons died in combat in Normandy in June, or were simply missing in action. The government shifted the timeline of death. They stole the truth from the parents to protect the reputation of the command structure. The families grieved for heroes who died storming the beaches of France, never knowing that their sons had actually died weeks earlier, victims of friendly fire and negligence in the cold waters of England. This is the essence of Stage 1. The truth is treated as a security leak. The memory of the dead is rewritten to fit the narrative of the state. For decades, Exercise Tiger remained a dirty little secret, a footnote that was scrubbed from the history books because it was inconvenient. But sometimes, the threat doesn't come from the enemy's torpedoes. Sometimes, the threat is sitting in our own cargo holds. And when that happens, the protocol shifts to Stage 2, deception. Stage 2 is not just about hiding a disaster from the public. It is about actively lying to the people who are trying to save the victims. To see this in action, we move to the Mediterranean theater. December 2nd, 1943, Bari Harbor, Italy. The Allies have captured the port. It is a vital supply line, packed with ships offloading fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies. It is supposed to be a safe zone, but on this night, the Luftwaffe launches a surprise air raid that would become known as the Pearl Harbor of Europe. Over 100 German Ju-80 bombers swoop in low. They achieve total surprise. They hit the ammunition ships. The explosions are massive. Windows are shattered 7 miles away. The harbor turns into a furnace. 27 Allied ships are destroyed. The scene is apocalyptic. The water is on fire. Sailors are jumping from burning decks into the harbor to escape the flames. They are swimming for their lives. But the water is covered in a thick, strange, oily sludge. The men swim through it. They are coated in it. They swallow it. They are pulled from the water, shivering and in shock, and taken to the Allied hospitals in the city. As the doctors and nurses begin to treat them, they notice something baffling. These men aren't just suffering from blast injuries or hypothermia. Their symptoms are wrong. Their eyes are swelling shut. Their skin is turning red and blistering. They are gasping for air as their lungs fill with fluid. Their blood pressure is collapsing. The medical staff is terrified. These look like chemical burns. But there haven't been any reports of gas attacks in the war. The doctors contact the port command. They ask a specific, urgent question. Was there any chemical agent in the harbor? Was there gas on any of those ships? And the command answers, no. This was the lie. This was Stage 2, in its purest, most lethal form. Floating in that harbor, burning alongside the other ships, was the Liberty ship SS John Harvey. And the John Harvey was carrying a cargo that was not on the standard manifest. It was carrying 2,000 M47A1 mustard gas bombs. The United States had secretly shipped this massive stockpile of chemical weapons to Italy. It was intended as a deterrent, a retaliatory stockpile in case the Nazis used gas first. But because the Geneva Protocol prohibited the use of such weapons, the very existence of the shipment was classified top secret. When the John Harvey exploded, the liquid mustard gas was released. It mixed with the oil floating on the surface of the water. It created a toxic, deadly sludge. The vapor cloud drifted over the harbor and into the city of Bari. Sailors swimming in the water were literally bathing in a chemical weapon. Winston Churchill and the Allied command knew exactly what was on that ship. But Churchill had issued a strict order. The presence of mustard gas in Italy must remain a secret at all costs. He feared that if the Germans found out the Allies had brought gas to Europe, they would use it as propaganda or as an excuse to unleash their own chemical stockpiles. And so the decision was made. The secret was prioritized over the lives of the sailors. The lie was maintained. Because the doctors were told there was no gas, they treated the men for simple shock and immersion. They did the worst possible thing. They wrapped the men in warm blankets. They gave them tea. They let them sit in their oil-soaked clothes. This was a death sentence. Mustard gas is a blistering agent. It absorbs through the skin. By wrapping the men in blankets, the doctors were unknowingly pressing the poison against their bodies, sealing it in, increasing the absorption rate. If the doctors had been told the truth, the treatment would have been simple. Wash the men off. A massive decontamination effort with soap and water would have neutralized the agent and saved hundreds of lives. Instead, the men died in agony. They died as their white blood cell counts collapsed. They died blindly, betrayed by their own leaders who refused to declassify a piece of information for 24 hours. In the aftermath, the cover-up continued. The medical reports were falsified. The deaths of over 600 Allied personnel and an unknown number of Italian civilians were blamed on burns due to enemy action. The British government wiped the mention of mustard gas from the official records. This is the cold calculus of Stage 2. The system decides that operational security is worth more than the lives of the men who serve it. The lie becomes the strategy, and the soldiers become the collateral damage of a secret they were never allowed to know. But as horrific as Exercise Tiger and Bari were, they were, in a sense, reactions to war. They were cover-ups triggered by enemy action or accidents. Stage 3 is different. Stage 3 is proactive. Stage 3 is premeditated. Stage 3 is experimentation. This is the final descent of the protocol. This is where the mask of the Allied hero slips completely, revealing a system that views its own citizens not as people, but as biological data points to be harvested. To see this, we don't need to look at a battlefield in Europe. We need to look at home. We need to look at the Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C., and the secret hospitals of the Manhattan Project. During the 1940s, the U.S. military was terrified of chemical warfare. They needed to know how effective their gas masks and protective suits were against mustard gas. But they didn't want to rely on theoretical models or animal data. They wanted human data. They wanted to see what happened to human skin when it was burned. So, the Naval Research Laboratory set up a series of experiments, but they didn't just ask for random volunteers. They made a specific, calculated choice. They explicitly targeted African American and Puerto Rican troops. Why? Because the scientists running these programs were operating under a racist, pseudo-scientific hypothesis. They wanted to test the theory that racial differences in skin pigmentation made darker-skinned men more resistant to chemical burns. This was the same kind of master race biological determinism that the Allies were supposedly fighting against in Germany. Yet here it was, being practiced by U.S. government scientists. These soldiers, many of them teenagers who had signed up to fight for their country, were treated like lab rats. They were locked in gas chambers. They were not told the full truth of what was happening. They were coerced or misled. Some were told they were testing summer clothing or new equipment. They were exposed to mustard gas and lewisite until their skin blistered and peeled. They suffered severe burns, long-term lung damage, and psychological trauma. They were scarred for life to test a hypothesis based on racism. The scientific value was negligible, but the human cost was total. The government viewed these men as expendable assets, useful only for the data their pain could generate. But the experimentation didn't stop at chemical weapons. It went nuclear. While the Naval Research Laboratory was burning soldiers with gas, the doctors of the Manhattan Project were conducting an even darker series of tests. They wanted to understand the effects of plutonium on the human body. They needed to know what radiation did to human tissue to set safety standards for the workers building the atomic bomb. But again, they didn't want to use volunteers. They chose the vulnerable. They chose people who couldn't say no. or who wouldn't know what was happening. They targeted the sick and the poor. Consider the case of Albert Stevens, known in the classified files only as CAL1. Albert was a house painter. He went to the hospital for a gastric ulcer. Doctors misdiagnosed him with terminal stomach cancer. They didn't tell him the truth. Instead, they saw an opportunity. Without his consent or knowledge, they injected him with a massive dose of plutonium. They wanted to see how long it would take to kill him, but Albert didn't have cancer. He lived for another 20 years. For 2 decades, the U.S. government monitored him, collecting his urine and stool samples, studying him like a biological specimen while he walked around carrying a radioactive substance in his bones. He died, never knowing what had been done to him. Or consider Simeon Shaw, codenamed CAL2. Simeon was a 4-year-old Australian boy suffering from bone cancer. He was flown to the United States, supposedly for treatment. Instead, he was injected with plutonium. His parents were never told. He was used as a calibration tool for nuclear data. His last days spent as a vessel for a government experiment. Or Elmer Allen, CAL3, an African-American railroad porter. He was injected with plutonium in his leg 3 days before doctors amputated it, just so they could study the tissue. These people were stripped of their humanity. In the official reports, they weren't even given names. They were reduced to codes. CAL1, CAL2, CAL3. They were dehumanized so that the scientists could sleep at night. This is stage 3, the ultimate betrayal. The moment when the state decides that the citizen exists only to serve the machine. When you look at these 3 stages together, suppression, deception, experimentation, you see the full shape of the protocol. It is a system that prioritizes the institution over the individual at every turn. In the case of Exercise Tiger, the priority was the secret of the invasion plans. The result was the erasure of 700 men and the deception of their families. In the case of Bari, the priority was the secret of the stockpile. The result was the tortured death of 600 sailors who could have been saved. In the case of the experiments, the priority was the secret of the data. The result was the violation of the very people the military was sworn to defend. This pattern forces us to rethink the narrative of the good war. We are told that the Allies fought for freedom, for justice, for the dignity of the individual. And in many ways they did. Defeating fascism was a moral necessity. But we cannot let that victory blind us to the gray war that was fought in the shadows. We cannot ignore the fact that the methods of the enemy, secrecy, racial experimentation, the weaponization of human beings, were quietly adopted by the victors when it was convenient. The infrastructure of the Cold War, the immunity deals for war criminals, the classified experiments, the silence imposed on victims, was not invented in the 1950s. It was forged in the fire of World War II. The Expendable Protocol is not ancient history. It is a blueprint. It shows us how power operates when it feels threatened. It shows us that transparency is the first casualty of war and that the truth is often the most dangerous weapon of all. For 80 years, these files were kept in the dark. They were stamped classified and hidden away. The men who ordered these cover-ups believed that history would never judge them because history would never know. But the archives are open now. The names are known. The pattern is visible. We can see the sequence. We can see the lies. Now, we can finally tell the truth. It is mathematical. It is cold, and it is waiting to be used again. The only defense we have is to know the pattern, to recognize stage 1 when we see it, to question stage 2 when we hear it, and to fight stage 3 before it happens. The files are open. The investigation continues. The protocol has been exposed.